Philip Gary would have been a seaman, a merchant seaman. So he'd been away on the boats for maybe 4 or 5, 6 months.
My mummy was a dolphin mistress. She worked in the mill.
My dad was a roofer.
My mother was a housewife.
He was a baker's labourer.
He was a docker.
She was very loving, a very sensitive woman.
He was a real family man. Everything was for her. We had 9 children.
Great mother, that's what she was. You couldn't get any better.
And he had to give you change or give you money for running the shop for cigarettes or for going to the bookies.
Loved the kids. Loved taking the kids down to Daddy Christmas.
We all loved him naturally, and he just loved life and enjoyed life.
Life at that time was very hard for everyone.
You had a whole series of events, the likes of the Falls Curfew in 1970, and then the likes of internment especially in August 1971, which, if you like, traumatised the entire community, where hundreds of people were being arrested and interned.
Oh, the place was in turmoil. You get bombs going off every day of the week, shootings, and it was pretty chaotic for the people out Belfast at the time.
I got used to what people call the troubles. I worked in a post office doing driving. I did a delivery where in the mornings, you went up what I would call up the Shankle and down the falls. Shankle Road would have been clear. Driving down the falls had been littered with burnt out cars and lorries.
I remember standing on the landing with my dad one night looking out the window when our 2 brothers, watching the boys putting the barricades up. It was all flagstones we were using. And then the next thing, there was this rattle of machine gun fire, and then all of a sudden there was nail bombs getting through. Basically that's how I come up with the start of the troubles, the first of it.
A couple of days before, I think that news had just broken out, that the major Republicans had escaped from Crummer Road Jail, and that was a lot of activity at that point in time. But this was, you took this as read because it wasn't unusual for it to be stopped by the army and asked and put against a wall to be searched. Didn't like it, but you sort of had to, go along with that activity. And it wasn't unusual for the area to be, see a fair number of army vehicles, even in normal circumstances, driving about the town and stuff like that, So it never took a great deal of thinking about, because this was, you nearly accepted normality was the army's going to be here for some time.
I remember that morning my mother and father had been out shopping. It was coming near Christmas. So my mummy had said, "What about your Christmas clothes?" And I says, "Mummy, sure, we'll get them next week." And she says, "Now, you never know what will happen by next week."
That Saturday morning, we were all up, we had our breakfast. My mum and dad done their usual thing. And then the next thing they said they were away into the town, because usually around their usual out spots, they probably will end up down Sailors Town first, start off with, and then work their way into the town. And then they usually call in the McGurk's now and again.
There was always something about that night that I'll never forget. I mean, it came to around about 8 o'clock, and the place was in darkness, and there was total silence. It used to be when you would have walked round a corner on the New Lodge Road, or any street in the New Lodge Road, you would have walked into a foot patrol. There was nothing, it was, the silence was deafening. It was, you heard your footsteps as you were walking down the street. In them days, there wasn't anything like Tesco's or Asda, so the shopping was done at your corner shop. So what they did every Saturday night, they would have went down to Lizzie's. They went into Lizzie's, and there was a woman being served, and my Lizzie apparently had said to my mummy and daddy, give me a few minutes and we'll get your stuff ready. And my mummy says, no, we'll not. We'll go on in here, sure. By the time you've got them ready, we'll have finished and we'll be back again. So my daddy says they didn't wait that night. They went on into the McGurk's. And then that was it, of course.
I was upstairs in the bedroom when I heard the explosion.
That's really shut the house, and I mean shut the house. You might as well say that it literally shut the whole the new lodge, you know.
And I can remember going, opening the window, and sitting on the bay window, and after the explosion went off, hadn't a clue, you know what I mean, no inclination about anything.
So I went out to the front door, seen people running about everywhere, and then suddenly started shouting, McGurk's got it.
We saw the smoke arising, so we automatically made our way down.
I went down the new lodge brick wall, and the next thing I seen was complete chaos.
As I got near, it was a hill, a hill of people.
It was just one complete pile of rubble, with hundreds of people on top of it, trying to tear it apart to save people.
And they were passing out the rubble one by one.
Somebody shouting through a halo, anybody from the decks.
And, you know, and the next thing was they were shouting, there's one here, here's one, oh, there's one over here, I've got another one. And that was it.
I didn't even know no more if I was in it.
My Uncle Terry, he was called away by a woman coming up the street. What I didn't know at that time was the woman was telling them that they had pulled my mummy and my daddy out of the rubble.
But that's my recollection of that night, and from that night, that was my life wiped out.
We were watching the football highlights when the programme was interrupted, and it says that we interrupted this programme for a special news bulletin about the casualties of McGurk's bar, and then a list of names started appearing on the television screen, and that's when my mother started screaming, and that's when my father jumped up out of his seat, because that was the first time we seen Philip Gary's name coming up on a television screen. And that was the first time we even realised that he was dead.
Her mum come up on early Sunday morning and told us the news. She could have maybe been up a bit earlier, but because she knew Margaret was expecting within a few weeks' time, and more weeks, didn't want to do any excitement because basically we couldn't have done anything. He was dead.
I was away, and Bobby was murdered on Saturday night. That happened, and I didn't find out till Monday.
The Brewers actually went around the hospitals and the morgues back and forth. And nobody told them anything in the morgues, nobody told them anything in the hospitals.
People in the morgue had taken a set of keys from the pocket of this dead person, and it was actually my Uncle Bobby, who was the Protestant, and he left the morgue with a set of keys, went back to Stanhope Drive, to the house, and it was only when he put the key in the door and the door opened that they realised that the body in the morgue was actually my grandfather.
It was my brother-in-law. I went and identified the body, and it was very hard for him too. And it was worse on the family when they were told how he was, I know my father was burnt in the eye. I know he was lying beside the gas line, and he was actually burnt. My mother's face was supposed to be badly done with the rubble.
it was always sticks in my mind that I was able to identify him okay, facial wise, and I don't want. I'll just leave it at that. But what I'd seen in the morgue is not like you'd see on TV. It was a very dark, black room. There was obviously things sitting about where there was looked to be obviously parts of bodies, not a whole, like, you know, sitting on the floor on stretchers and stuff like that. And I found that difficult. You know, that there was obviously things had been recovered. It looks to be, you know, I was saying to myself, those people, like, I was lucky to a degree that I was able to identify them without any much difficulty. And it always stuck in my head afterwards that I'd asked the director of the funeral undertaker to do certain things. He said that would be no bother. And his coffin and one other coffin were the only coffins of the 15 people that were open, able to people to come in at a wake and come in and view him and one of the wee boys, you know. So we had that sort of, at least some really, that way we could be with him, if you understand. I mean, people had, what I call it, the remains of their family in a box which they couldn't see, which I thought would have been very, very difficult for other families, you know, too.
Not once did a policeman, not once did a professional counsellor or trained counsellor even come anywhere near us.
The police didn't even come to the door. They only got the guts to come to the door. They only got the decency to come to the door to tell anybody where anybody was or what was happening to anybody. I was actually a friend of the families, identified my father, and then that's how we knew.
My daddy was in a room on his own, and my Uncle Jim had to tell him that my mummy was dead, and I remember him crying. And that was the first time ever that I'd seen sadness or a man cry, you know. And he signed himself out because, I mean, he was very badly injured himself. He'd cut some bruises and his body had been burned, you know.
One of the brothers noticed that we had the wrong body, and it wasn't my father. And the simple reason why he knew that, because he insisted on having my father's coffin open. And when it was open, he recognised my father's wee finger, because my father lost his finger years and years ago in attacks. And he knows the other person's finger was fully there.
McCain's body came to our house, and my father's body went to Kane's house. And you know yourself, at Belfast at that time, getting from North Belfast to West Belfast, you know, was pretty chaotic.
We eventually got there, with the help of nobody else. No cops, no undertakers, no this, no that. I'm near sure the undertakers were involved, but I knew nothing about it. But as I say, we ended up getting the body sorted out. And that was a big knock in the face too, you know, through that sort of thing.
And the coffin came in, and my daddy says about the lid, but they wouldn't lift the lid off because my mother, as you know, she was burnt alive. And just as they set the coffin down, the army came in, straight into the door, demanding that the coffin lid be lifted open because they were searching for guns and ammunition. They had went round the whole area at the night of the bombing, and they had searched people's homes, the people of those that were killed. They were trying to link someone that had been killed in the bomb to the IRA in order to prove that it was the IRA that done it. And I remember my father slowly and quietly getting up from the chair. He had been sitting in the chair at the corner, and he spoke to the army officer. The army officer went into the hall, went through the radio, came in again and saluted my father and turned to the army and says, "We're leaving now." My daddy during the war was a colour sergeant in the Royal Irish Fusiliers. So the next day then they came back with a reeve to my daddy.
There was a Welsh regiment, I think the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers or something, but they would have been mostly Catholics, funny enough. And at one point they actually came to the door of the wake house and said how sorry they were to my grandmother and whatever. And they come in and basically paid their respects. which is something, you know what I mean, unique, something you wouldn't have seen or wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have heard of years later. But that was something a humanitarian gesture on behalf of some of the soldiers who would have been in the district at that time. They started burying them, you know, two and three, you know, two or three funerals in the morning, two or three in the afternoon.
There was crowds, or hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of crowds there, like from the New Lodge right up the Falls Road.
Or a massive turnout.
Processing down Lever Street and then down the New Lodge Road and along North Street.
Along Carrickhill, Millfield, and walked the whole way to Milltown Cemetery, you know.
There was a few, now I'm not saying all caps gave a final salute. There was two or three, and I would say those two or three caps would have been old timers who knew the people that are from Sailorstown, what have you know.
You imagine getting towards the Palamashankel, and there's hundreds of men, now not children, men and women, and they have Union Jacks and they have Ulster flags and they have all sorts of, and they're screaming and they're shouting.
When the corpse was going over, the other side of religion, they were singing and dancing, which made pretty bad for my parents and all of us.
There was a song in the pop charts at the time called Bits and Pieces. You know, it was a hit in the pop charts in 1971.
Each time at any funeral went across Peter's Hill or Lower Shankill, they got the same treatment.
Men and women, and they were singing Bits and Pieces about my grandfather.
Because 15 people are now dead, how could anybody come out and sing a song like that?
That has stuck with me and stayed with me for 40 years or more. You know, it's had a profound impact on my life then. You know.
It was one of the biggest explosions in the loss of life in Northern Ireland at that time. I had said to myself, you know, if people seen what I seen down in the morgue, there'd be no more bombings. And always, when we were walking up the Falls Road, behind a funeral, we had heard a bomb going off, and I just said, well, so much for that thought that I had, there'd be no more bombings, you know, so. The one thing that sticks and stuck in my head ever since was the radio broadcast on the Sunday morning, on Sunday, when the bulletins gave out, you know, that there's a bomb explosion. It was an IRA own goal.
And within 12 hours, the senior RUC inspectors on the scene, they had to write up a report called the duty officer's report, and basically they started telling lies. They started in this report saying that the bomb exploded. It was brought to the bar by a known member of the Provisional IRA to be collected by another known member of the Provisional IRA to be taken to somewhere else, and the bomb had exploded prematurely inside the bar. But where did all that come from?
These stories were given out by Thiefville Barracks over in Lisburn. They were told, they were given statements out by the police and by the army, and that was it. So rather than go and investigate it, they were just given what to write, and that was it.
The very first talk was they were making the bomb inside. And those who were inside knew what was going on, so they were all classed as bombers.
If you get a statement from the RUC headquarters, that's what the journalists, it was lazy, shoddy journalism, and in a way they were colluding with the state and just instead of trying to do their own investigative journalism.
The following morning, the RUC put this disinformation into black and white, and from our archived research, this is where the disinformation began. This is where the black propaganda emanated from.
the story that was put out that it was an IRA goal. Well, that was it. We were IRA, we were Republicans, we were terrorists. They caused it to themselves, they don't deserve anything.
You have eyewitnesses reports, literally from within hours. If you go back to the RTE recordings at the time, there's actually a statement from a young boy who was a newspaper boy, and he actually seen the car pulling up. He sees the man getting out, going over, lighting the package and running back to the car, and then the car driving off. And as it drove past him, he actually saw the Union Jack sticker on the back of the car. So he's given this evidence to the RTE and was then given it to the police. But instead of accepting that evidence, plus the evidence of other eyewitnesses who witnessed the actual bombing itself, instead of accepting that, the police just concentrated on this fictitious idea that it was a so-called own goal, which was a heinous term to describe any atrocity, but I mean, that's what they kept calling it, an IRA own goal.
14 years of age, I was wondering. I didn't know who to believe. I didn't know what to believe, you know. Listening to my father and that, I mean, yes, they knew. My father was saying there was nobody in the bar. We weren't doing anything. They were sitting there. He remembers, he talked about his smell and all that there. I mean, my father was telling the truth.
The sort of pub Paddy McGurk ran was you weren't even allowed to curse in it. And that went for everybody. You know what I mean? There was no politics. Actually, the RUC drunk in the pub. You know what I mean? There was a barracks there called Glenravell Street Barracks, and the RUC would call in and have a drink. That's the sort of pub Paddy McGurk run.
McGurk's was a Christian boy, you may as well say. Paddy McGurk was a real good man. Didn't allow any cursing. He called anybody cursing, he had to swear backs out, making you put money on it.
Paddy McGurk, I always remember black and white television set, you know, with the thing, and coming on the television saying that not only did he pray for the people who had been killed and injured, he prayed for the people that planted the bomb. Now that, you know, you can't get any better Christianity attitude about things. When he had lost his wife, his daughter, his business, he had been injured himself, his business had been wrecked, and he's coming out with a statement like that within a very short period after the bomb had happened. I just found that, you know, very uplifting that he could do that, you know.
So here you had 3 senior RUC inspectors basically fabricating the story. And that was the initial lie about the bomb. And then as the days went on, it grew legs. Do you know what I mean? Brian Faulkner brought it to, when he had to go to London to explain what was happening, he then takes the lie with him on the Monday. And this isn't me talking in that sense. We now have official government documents that are stamped private, confidential, but under the 30-year rule or the 40-year rule, in this case, the families have got access to them. So we can prove categorically that the Prime Minister of the time starts embellishing the story, and even at one point in his account, his written account, we have the minutes of the meeting with the British Home Secretary, he starts to say that he, as Prime Minister, has now instructed the RUC not to investigate the bombers, but to put their time and energy into investigating the families to see if any of the Emmons have got IRA sympathies or if they got IRA connections. So he's actually interfering in the biggest mass murder of people in the history of the 6-county state.
On the 16th of December 1971, less than 2 weeks after the bombing, the RUC Chief Constable, during the Joint Security Committee meeting, stood in front of the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, the Minister of State for Home Affairs and the General Officer Command of the British Forces in the North at that time, and told them directly that 2 of our family members were known IRA terrorists. This, of course, was a blatant lie and has never been substantiated in any evidence that has been presented to us by the HET or the Police Ombudsman.
Within 6 or 7 hours after that bomb went off, and they kept this up, and they spread them lies all around the world.
And then the next day you have the John Taylor, who was Minister for Home Affairs. He stands up in Stormont Parliament and says basically what he was, the same lie that he's been fed previously by the RUC. And then the British Army, in their reports, you call them sit reps or situation reports. We have a number of them for the 6th and the 14th, where they're actually expanding that that 5 of the people who were killed in the bar, we now know that they must have been standing around it. So they're trying to give this impression of 5 people standing around a bomb, i.e. as if they were manufacturing it and it exploded. And they were saying, oh, the forensic evidence now proves that the bomb was inside the bar and it was being made by the people inside the bar. The forensic reports weren't even made public until February 1972. So this is, you know what I mean, in the days after the explosion. All these people start concocting these stories.
When I heard the statement a couple of days later about young McCrory, the young newspaper boy, seeing someone at the bar, I said, now that sounds more like what had happened. And the interview, he had done an interview with RTE very shortly, but afterwards. And when I seen the thing about the interview, that I said, well, that seems more like what had happened. And it wasn't long afterwards, when we were starting to get my thoughts together about how this all happened, I realised, this wasn't meant for McGurk's. If this was the guys wanting to plant a bomb, the one that they'd have been wanting to hit was the GM. And the propaganda had been ready and set when the bomb went off, and the propaganda would all come in, bang, bang, bang. There's an IRA unit, etc., an IRA bomb.
And even when he started to get the forensics, and the forensics were starting to prove that the families weren't, in other words, that some of the people whose bodily injuries included shrapnel wounds of wood. In other words, there was a door between them and the bomb, and then the bomb exploded, blew the door apart, and then they were getting shreds of wood as part of their injuries.
And in fact, my father-in-law and a couple of others had wooden splinters in their back, which sort of proved there was a wooden structure between them and the bomb.
All that would have told you that the bomb was outside. Do you understand? That was never brought up. In fact, it was repressed when it came to the inquest.
Now, what we didn't know at the time, which we subsequently found out, and I was really miffed about this point, was that they had got other forensic reports as well, not only Dr. Hall's report. They had got other reports about the clothing of the injured and the people who were killed, and not all the forensic of their clothing showed not one of them had any sort of what been near a bomb itself. We've seen the paperwork. They had that information weeks before the inquest, yet they didn't release it. They didn't mention it at the inquest, and that would have shown clearly, confirmed along with the forensic, pathology, his report, that the bomb was planted by others. Yet they didn't do that, and I couldn't take it in. That here was the people supposed to uphold the law, supposed to be looking after the law. I can understand people making mistakes and doing things, but deliberately holding information back in connection with that there, which would have cleared the whole matter at that point in time, and they didn't do that.
And that still kept on and on and on, even after Robert Campbell was convicted.
In July 1977, Robert James Campbell was arrested for terrorist activity, and during questioning by police, which didn't seem too heavy, I hasten to add, he admitted that he was in the car that had bombed McGurk's bar in 1971. He also admitted to planning the killing of John Morrow, a Protestant worker who had been driving a van in West Belfast whenever it was attacked by his platoon. Mr. Morrow saved the lives of many people in the back who happened to be Catholics, but he himself was killed.
And we were told, and one officially, he was told to get himself up because he killed a person instead of a Catholic.
In March 1976, the head of the CID in Belfast was given a list of 5 names of 5 UVF people who were believed to be responsible for McGurk's. So a year later, when Robert James Campbell was arrested for something else, but admitted to being, responsible for McGurk's or being part of the team, if you go back and look at the original list, do you understand? His name is at the top of it. So if his name's true out of the 5 names, what do you think you should do with the other 4 names? Do you understand? At the very least, you would think they should be arrested and questioned. You don't have to be an expert on any of this, but you'd think you'd arrest them, put them into 4 separate rooms and say, look, Campbell's squealing like a pig and he's named you. But they weren't even arrested, not even till this day.
The confession that he made. They were sitting in this car waiting. They wanted to plant the bomb at the Gem Bar, but they couldn't because there was always somebody standing outside the Gem Bar. So it came to about 29. They'd been sitting there from 8 o'clock. So it came to about 25 to 20 to 8. They realised they were told they were to deliver that bomb and they were not to come back unless it was delivered. Now, so they knew they had to get rid of it. They couldn't sit any longer because the bomb could have been sweating itself, the gelignite. So they drove up and they turned left, and the next pub they came to was McGurk's Bar.
That they didn't want to admit that McGurk's was an atrocity committed by loyalists, because don't forget, internment was in its infancy. The state was fighting the IRA, was arresting and interning Catholics, nationalists, Republicans. So for them to admit that the UVF had just murdered 15 men, women and children would have forced a rethink and would have forced the state to start arresting Protestants. In other words, UVF, UDA, terrorists, and putting them in jail as well. So rather than have to face that appalled vista, as someone else would have says, that instead of accepting that reality, they buried it. And the same as they tried to bury our families and blame them for something that they didn't do.
There was a policy in place at that time entitled Arrest Policy for Protestants, which dictated Protestants and Protestant extremists were not to be interned, and they were not interned until 1973.
This stigma was still attached to our families, that they were part and parcel of a bombing team.
People didn't really know. Was it a bomb planted by loyalists? So I think there was always that suspicion that, especially because it was coming from government sources and the media and the British Army and the police and politicians.
The community had a certain reservation in connection with whether, there was some truth to the propaganda that was going out or not, because for some years afterwards, certain people would not have talked to other people because they felt that this was true.
If they had done a proper investigation at the start, and they had been seen to be impartial, in other words, not being anti-Catholic, not being anti-nationalist, that you could have had a situation where a lot of people would have started to give more faith and more confidence towards the powers of the state. But instead you felt alienated, you felt aggrieved, you felt pushed away, you felt unheard.
No counselling came towards us at all. We weren't offered anything whatsoever. Nobody. The only thing we had was our friends and family and our neighbours.
As my mother said, it was through prayer, not that she ever was able to cope. And my dad.
I think down the years that there was no formal structures for any sort of professional counselling or professional health. And basically we're just told to get on with it, you know what I mean, and make do.
Oh yes, there was always a bitterness. I mean, it was the deaths that they all got, but it never goes away, never goes away, you know? And you just have to try and carry on, which is hard. I mean, it's 40 years now and still it's going on.
But it was a lot of weeks afterwards. I remember getting up to use the bathroom and I heard crying. Now my granny, we lived with my granny at the time, my daddy's mummy. We always lived with her. And my daddy was crying and she was actually cradling him in her arms. Now it's all right. I mean, remember, that was her baby. You know, that was her baby. And he was saying, but it's my fault. I should have made her stay in the shop. I should have made her stay in the shop. He says, and then he says, I couldn't help them. He could. This was a man that was lying underneath a collapsed building, but he was guilty. He was guilty because she wanted to go from the shop into a pub. He was guilty because he couldn't get her out. It kept pushing the rubble from him. He told my granny, he kept pushing it, and he couldn't help Mr. and Mrs. Keenan. He was guilty, and he was guilty because he was the only one out of the four of them left alive. My father would have sat in a chair. He had the one chair that he sat on, and he'd have dozed off. My daddy would have been sitting there pushing, going like this, and doing that. And it wasn't actually until he died. Every time he closed, he was trying to push the rubble away from him. You know, he closed his eyes. That was it. It all came alive to him again.
The moment the bomb exploded, our campaign for truth started. My peers, the other family members, have campaigned tirelessly and relentlessly for 4 decades now to try and clear the name of their loved ones. It is a campaign they have waged with dignity and constitutionally as well, it should be said. Aside from going and knocking on doors of politicians, letter writing, going to speaking to other campaigning groups, we have had to spend most of our time going through public records, through military documents, through freedom of information in order to try for ourselves to source the truth. It has been left to us and our great friends in the Pat Finnegan Centre and British Irish Rights Watch to do this. We're
now into a generational thing. I mean, my grandmother has died, my mother has passed on, and my elder sister, who would have been involved and took a keen interest in the campaign, she has died. So that's just our family. You replicate that across the other families, and you can actually see now at some of the meetings, the McGurk's family meetings, that you're now having grandchildren coming to the table. Do you know what I mean? They're sort of coming, they want to learn more, they want to become, what can we do to help? And it was especially noticeable there for the 40th anniversary on the 4th of December last, where young children, in other words, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the McGurk's bar people who were murdered, they came forward and they helped. You know, we had this project to recreate the bar, to put the bar, the facade of the bar back in place the way it was, and they were actively involved. So you can see it's coming down through the generations, because 40 years has taken a terrible toll physically, and emotionally and psychologically on the families. But you're getting inspiration by the fact that there's other ones prepared to take up the mantle and are prepared to step forward and say, well, we'll take the torch now and we'll follow it forward.
I'm not an educated person, to tell you the truth, because in my younger days, after my mother and father were killed, I never really went to school. But I've done wee bits and pieces here and there. I've been in the building game and I know a wee bit about the building game, and now I'm a lorry driver. And I've worked my way up. I've worked hard for it. I've worked on all sorts of bad wires. But with this campaign, it's opened my eyes big time of what's actually going behind doors, closed doors. The lies is actually going on.
I never grieved for my mother until this last lot of years, I would be honest with you, until I really got into the research of the McGurk's bar bombing.
We now have had 2 reports by the Historical Inquiries team, and we've now had 2 reports by the Police Ombudsman's Office. But the state, in the form, in this case, in the form of the Chief Constable, who wasn't even here in 1971, he can't bring himself to admit that what the RUC did in 1971 was wrong. Well, that's just another stab, it's another knife through the heart. We got the Ombudsman's report, the second Ombudsman's report, and basically the families felt vindicated. Here at last was an official government report that says that the RUC was wrong. They didn't use the word collusion, which we objected to, but they did use the term investigative bias in terms of the RUC, you know, concentrating solely on the own goal theory and not even taking into account the possibility that the loyalists may have been responsible, that led to investigative bias on the part of the RUC. So we felt vindicated. We came out and we said that to the media almost within 2 hours or whatever. The RUC, in the form of the Chief Constable, PSNI, in the form of Matt Baggett, had issued 3 separate statements saying that, in their opinion, they weren't accepting the report.
When we got the documentation from the RUC of their archives and stuff like that there's certain information destroyed or can't be found or no trace of, you know, disappears. But the British Army, they keep everything. You know, and this is amazing because if we can actually, we've tracked the stuff down, but the stuff that we were looking for from particularly the RUC seems to have gone walkies. You know, can't be found. Documents, letters that they had written to the pathologists and stuff like that there. We got the pathologist letter, the RUC letter, can't be traced. The information in connection with some of the information there, witnesses about cross telephone lines, documentation, which is witnesses' reports, RUC, can't be traced. Strange.
RUC people who are now being asked to investigate the wrongdoings of other RUC people or other Special Branch people 40 years ago. And to me, that's nonsense. You can't have the police investigating the police. And it's the same with the Ombudsman's Office. We at the start had more faith in the Ombudsman's Office than we did in the HET. But now it has proven that there's even people within the Ombudsman's Office who are acting as gatekeepers, and they're dictating, I mean, like words like collusion can't and won't be used, that these people are dictating how reports, in other words, reports are being written by the Ombudsman's Office, and instead of being made public, are then being rewritten to suit the agenda of the old guard. it's indefensible. You cannot defend it. And for us, to blame the wrong organisation for 40 years and to cover up what they did for 40 years, it was wrong.
Why is there flaws here and flaws there? What have they got to hide? And a simple apology, that was all we asked for in the first place. And they wouldn't have to go through all this.
Personally, I believe there was collusion between the state, but in other words, between the British Army, particularly military intelligence, and the bombers. It's hard. It has been hard to prove conclusively, but then you need to be clear about your definition of collusion. What involves collusion? I mean, is it, the British Army supplying these people with weapons and explosives? No, in my opinion. But collusion, that is collusion, but collusion can also mean after the event, withholding information and deliberately setting up a false narrative. In other words, giving these people an alibi, giving these people a story. That's basically what happened.
We believe, right, there's somebody good there that has to come out to tell the truth. Somebody in there has to do. So this is our way of going down this road and seeing if they can help us.
I am more convinced now that the McGurk's families on their own aren't strong enough. That we need the active support and the active help of other families, of other campaigns, of other individuals who can all come together and say to the state, you need to resolve this issue, or else we're going to end up in court for the next 20 years. Separate cases, separate families, taking individual court action, taking individual prosecutions, taking individual civil action. So, to find this is the last unresolved issue. We solved the policing by and large. We solved the idea of people working together in Parliament together. But this is it. The big one that is hard to deal with, the legacy of the past. Until we get some sort of international independent body to deal with this, it's still going to drag on. And those with a vested interest that the truth doesn't come out are still going to dig in their heels and still going to refuse the families access to the documentation and access to what is required for them to get closure.
I honestly don't think politicians care about the victims.
In the old days, when people were being murdered by both sides, they were the first ones to jump on the bandwagon to glorify themselves. But now, when the victims are asking for help, they don't want to know. That's across all parties.
Nobody thinks about the survivors of the shootings, the survivors of the bombers, the bombings. Nobody thinks of them.
I'm glad to see people sitting in bars nowadays where they're safe. The way things are nowadays, to me, is I can't go on with my future.
And a lot of people would say to me, why don't you forget about it? It's gone, it's dusted, forget about it. People just want to throw it aside. But our past is our history, and our past is our future.
There's something, if you like, is unfinished business. You would like to go away and be able to do something else with your life. But there's something you just feel compelled that the dead cannot speak, and we have to try and speak for them and be their voice. and try and act on their behalf to say that these people were innocent and that these people deserve justice.
Everybody's entitled to know the truth, no matter what, Catholic, Protestant, or various different nationalities been killed in these troubles too. You know what I mean? Everybody's entitled to know the truth, or how their loved ones was murdered and who was responsible for it.
My grandmother, she would always say that she never wanted prosecutions. She never wanted to see people go to jail. All she wanted was someone to come and say that her husband, Phil Gary, was innocent. He was just an ordinary Catholic who went out that night for a pint of Guinness and was killed, that he wasn't a bomber.
That was the only thing that we wanted, was a simple apology and for our loved ones' names to be vindicated, to have their innocence put back, because their innocence was taken away by an authority that was supposed to be there to protect them.
They were all innocent people, and just to get justice for them and clear their name, you know, that's what just people want now.
I just want the truth. I'm not wanting the people to go to court and get hung and done, etc., etc. All I want is the truth to come out and admit the truth publicly.
I would be happy with the truth, because that's what we've been fighting for all these years, the truth.
Our contention always was that the truth costs nothing, its inquiries cost millions.
Best closure for us is for the state, in the form of the police and the army and the government, to admit finally and publicly to the world that what happened in 1971, it wasn't our families that was to blame, it was the UVF. And then on top of that, it was compounded by the statements and the actions of senior RUC, British Army and British government ministers.
But I think society out here should turn around and say, right, it's time to ask what's going on here. The truth has to be told, and that's it. If these people can't go on with the past, then we can't go on with our future either, because the past is always going to come up no matter what.
Well, I'd like people out there to come out and say, right, let's get these people together, to ask them what they need, to give them a forum to speak, to be able to tell their story, so that everybody, so that the likes of the government, politicians, everybody come out and say, these people have suffered and they are still suffering. We need to get the truth out to these people. We need to make sure that this never happens again in this society.